What's up everyone, I'm Miss Peer Editor, and today I'm showing you how to analyze Robert Frost's poems by annotating one of his most famous pieces, Mending Wall, step by step. You can check out my Instagram, TikTok, and Medium pages using the links in the description, and please subscribe if you find this video helpful. Before we dive into the poem, let's cover some basic information about Frost's background to give us some context. Robert Frost was an American writer who was born in San Francisco but grew up in Massachusetts, and he's generally known as a quintessential New England poet. He attended two universities in this region, Harvard and Dartmouth, but didn't actually finish his degree at either institution. He combined traditional poetic techniques from the 1800s, including a consistent meter or rhythmic pattern, as well as rhymes, with modernism, which broke the boundaries of earlier poetry by allowing writers to explore less rigid structures and newer, less romanticized topics such as war, destruction, and technology. Frost was well known in his lifetime, since he won 4 Pulitzer Prizes and was asked by President John F. Kennedy to read a poem at his inauguration. Some recurring subjects in Frost's poetry include life in New England, nature, labor, social bonds, powers and limitations of the individual, dreams, memories, and the imagination, and destruction and death. Let's take a look at Mending Wall, a poem that appears in many English curriculums. I've broken up this poem into 3 chunks. This is the first chunk. Please pause this video to read it over. Okay, I assume you've paused this video, so let's jump in. First, let's examine the structure by extracting the first few lines. This poem is written in blank verse, which means that there's no rhyme, but there is a meter. This poem loosely follows iambic pentameter, meaning that every line has 10 syllables. In iambic pentameter, you'll typically see an unstressed syllable, then a stressed syllable, then an unstressed syllable, then a stressed syllable, and so on. However, this poem doesn't exactly follow this pattern all the time. Note that the words throughout the text contain 1 to 2 syllables. This is a very common technique in Frost's poems, and these shorter words make the poem flow smoothly. Moreover, the words he's using are more colloquial and folksy, words that you'd hear from an everyday person rather than an elitist academic. This first chunk alone also mimics real speech because it contains 4 full sentences. Frost writes this poem as if he's a friend telling us a story. In the first line, our narrator, an unnamed person, immediately establishes a mysterious mood. He says that there's some force that doesn't love this wall. So this force is creating a gap in the wall by pushing the ground upward and causing the upper rocks to fall. The very first word, something, makes the reader question what this force could be. When we hear that 2 can pass abreast or side by side in this gap, we as readers can visualize how big this gap is. It's disruptive and can't be ignored. The narrator discusses 3 parties that could have been involved in the formation of this gap. A hunter may have moved the stones to reveal a rabbit that might have burrowed inside the wall, and by doing so, the hunter would give their dog a target to catch. We can see that this narrator is an analytical person who's evaluating potential scenarios. In terms of syntax, Frost employs enjambment, where a sentence runs over one line into the next without any form of punctuation that signals a break. This line ends with the word repair, but continues the sentence with the word where in the next line, so it's an example of enjambment. There's no comma, period, colon, etc. in between. Not only does this make the poem appear more fluid, but the reader also can follow the narrator's authentic thought process. If the poem had rhymes and punctuation at the end of each line, it would sound like a very curated composition. Because the poem feels conversational, the reader trusts the narrator more because he's just relating his experience. We don't feel as though he has an agenda. When the narrator states that no one has seen the gaps made or heard them made, he implies that nature works when no one is watching. Nature is a force beyond human control. Frost often expresses awe and appreciation for nature, and the narrator seems to share this appreciation. His tone does not appear overly angry at the sight of these gaps. Instead, he merely notes that these gaps have formed silently over time. The following line could be an allusion to a quote from the Bible, which says that there is a time for everything, and a season for every activity under heaven, a time to tear and a time to mend. Spring is one of nature's cyclical seasons, and it's a time for rebirth, rebuilding, and new beginnings. The word mend is particularly important because it's a part of the title of this poem. Mending Wall describes the activity that the narrator is discussing throughout the piece, but as we'll see later on, he's not only talking about repairing the wall in a literal sense. Mending also refers to the idea of repairing human relationships and solidifying societal bonds. The phrase walk the line is an idiom that you may have heard in daily conversations, and it means that there's a delicate balance between two alternatives. For example, someone might walk the line between morality and immorality. Walking the line means you're maintaining a neutral stance, usually to follow society's norms and customs, rather than taking one side. Here's the second chunk of the poem. Please pause this video and read it over. Alright, let's resume our analysis. This metaphor, which compares the boulders or rocks that form the wall to loaves and balls, is actually connected to the contrast between two alternatives that I mentioned earlier. When you think of loaves, you might think of food and sustenance, something that's necessary for human survival. On the other hand, a ball is an object we use in games for leisure. We don't need a ball to survive. The contrast between these two objects echoes the contrasting choices in the narrator's mind. He's pondering whether this wall is necessary or not. This underlined piece of dialogue has a playful, teasing tone. The narrator implies that these rocks have a mind of their own, but again, he's not overly concerned or upset about this fact. He later mentions the outdoor games, perhaps reminiscing about childhood to evoke nostalgia and suggesting that this wall isn't something to be taken too seriously. Next, the narrator uses two metaphors to compare his neighbor to pine trees and himself to an apple orchard. This is a tricky instance of a literary device because it is literal in the sense that there are actual pine and apple trees forming a border between the neighbor's property and the narrator's property, but at the same time, the narrator is imparting attributes of these two trees to himself and his neighbor. Pine trees are usually seen as symbols of peace and serenity, whereas apples are symbols of sin and deceit. In the Bible, Eve, who is the first woman on earth, bites into an apple from a specific tree in the Garden of Eden, even though God told her not to. A serpent in the garden convinces her to do this. In this poem, the neighbor is wary of the narrator, who could pose a threat, which the apple symbolizes. The narrator wants to preserve his own solitude, and he wants to protect his pine trees and property from any threat that's posed by the outside world. Next is perhaps the most famous line of this poem: "Good fences make good neighbors." This quote reveals the irony behind this whole situation. First off, when you think of a good neighbor, you think of someone who's friendly and generous, but a fence is none of those things. In fact, it's the opposite. It's a border that separates you from other people. This whole situation is also ironic because these two neighbors are coming together to mend this wall, which indicates that they're trying to resolve differences and forge a bond, but they are only coming together to repair a border that is ultimately meant to keep them apart. Note that this is the first time that Frost uses the word fence rather than wall. Fences are made of wooden slats and they're completely man-made. Walls can be man-made as well, but in this case, this wall is made of stones that come directly from the earth. By using the word fence, the neighbor implies that these barriers aren't a matter of circumstance. Barriers should be thoughtfully constructed by humans with the purpose of separating ourselves from each other. The narrator says that spring is the mischief in me, offering an alternate meaning of spring. Spring not only means rebirth, but it also means troublemaking and a bit of tomfoolery. After all, April Fool's Day occurs in the spring. The narrator is mischievous because he wants to tease his neighbor and poke fun at him. The questions that the narrator asks display mischief as well as curiosity. He genuinely wants to understand why the neighbor wants a wall in this particular area. Here's the third and last chunk. Please pause this video. Okay, let's continue. In this portion of the poem, the narrator asks what he's walling in or walling out, underscoring the fact that there are two sides to a wall and therefore two purposes: protection from danger outside or trapping something inside. Next, the narrator considers suggesting that elves caused this gap, utilizing a humorous tone, but he wishes the neighbor would say this himself. This wish conveys the narrator's desire for warmth and connection with his neighbor. The narrator uses a simile to compare his neighbor to an old stone savage armed, painting a picture of someone, an early human, equipped with a stone as a weapon. This image of an ancient human makes the reader consider the idea that our natural human instinct is to protect ourselves. To compete for resources and survival, we often turn inward and shield ourselves from other people who could cause us harm. When the narrator states that the neighbor moves in darkness, the narrator is considering two potential meanings of darkness: the literal, which is the lack of light that we see in nature, and the figurative, which is oblivion or ignorance. Sometimes humans seek out the darkness. We want to stay in our own world and ignore what's happening around us. In the last two lines, the neighbor's tone is self-satisfied and adamant. The narrator indicates that the neighbor is pleased with himself for remembering the saying, "Good fences make good neighbors." And the fact that the neighbor repeats it shows that he believes the wall is necessary and will not change his opinion. Let's create an overview or study guide for Mending Wall. The structure of this poem is blank verse written in rough iambic pentameter, and Frost uses full sentences for the most part with punctuation. We have two characters: the narrator, a curious individual who ponders the wall's purpose and seeks human connection, and the neighbor, a stubborn individual who values privacy and property rights. This poem contains multiple symbols. The most important one is the wall, which represents borders or forces such as suspicion or prejudice that keep people from forming genuine relationships with each other. Pine trees represent peace and solitude, whereas apples symbolize threats, such as malicious or deceitful intentions. Elves represent imagination and the playfulness we often lose in adulthood. In terms of style, let's examine tone and diction. The overall tone of the poem shifts from playful to disappointed or dispirited. We're thinking about the narrator's tone here because the poem is written from the narrator's perspective. At the beginning, he's making small jokes and referencing childhood games, but by the end, he's lost hope of forming a warm relationship with his neighbor. We can synthesize all of the information to create several theme statements. Here are some themes. Humans can either follow their defensive instinct and keep others out entirely, or they can connect with others even if they may face conflict. It is difficult to unlearn the behaviors and prejudices that our families teach us. Our desire for camaraderie in childhood often wanes in adulthood when we prioritize our individual needs over those of our community. Lastly, nature is ungovernable, no matter how much humans try to tame it. Thanks so much for watching. In the comments, feel free to write any other themes you found in the poem. If you found this analysis helpful, please like, subscribe, and tap the bell to receive notifications whenever I make a new video. I'm Miss Pure Editor, and I'll see you next time.